Here we are. It's really heavy. Hi, hello, I hope you're taking care of yourself. If you're new here, my name is Lexi, and welcome to the first wrap-up of the entire year. I did not do a December wrap-up last year. Life got in the way, as you know. So we're gonna be doing both months today, December and January, a bi-monthly kind of situation. And it kind of works out because I had lighter than usual months in terms of how much I was able to read. I got through about 6 books in December and then 9 in January, which is an above average amount of books if you're like a normal civilian out in the world, but it's below average for me as somebody who reads as a part of my job. Normally I get through like 10 to 12. Obviously last month I was really busy with the holidays and the video that shall go down in infamy forever, but this month I really had no excuse. I think I've just been kind of dead inside, which is fine. It happens sometimes. I've been surviving the only way that I know how. It's important to have empathy for yourself when you're going through a difficult time for your mental health, and I'm trying to practice what I preach, so it's fine. I will read at the speed of light again when the ocean inside of my spirit stops like tidal waving all of the time, all over the place. This makes no sense, but I hope you understand the metaphor. The point is, I have a total of 15 books to get through in this video from December and January. We're gonna go like mostly chronologically. I'm not going to spoil anything beyond what you can find on the back of the book or just like general vibes of what you can derive from my reaction to the story. One thing about me is that I love yapping. I don't know when to stop talking. Nobody taught me when I was young, so nobody knows how long this is going to be. I normally take more notes and just have more bullet points inside of the document that I refer to when I film videos like this, but today we're just mostly gonna be riffing. We're gonna see how it goes. But before we just start cooking through this list, I want to transition to Past Me, who is jumping in real quick with a word from today's sponsor, which is Book of the Month. If you've never heard about them before, which would surprise me if you've been following my channel for any amount of time, Book of the Month is a subscription service that specializes in bringing the best and the brightest of the book world directly to your doorstep for an affordable price. Every single month they have their team pick out 5 or so of the hippest and coolest new releases, in addition to typically some really awesome add-ons as well. And rather than being confronted with every book to ever exist when you're trying to figure out your next read, you as a subscriber have the privilege of picking from a much smaller and better curated list, which just makes it way easier to find something that's going to ultimately work for you. But if for whatever reason one month just none of the books seem up your alley, you can also just skip that month, no questions asked, and you won't be charged. Your credits will roll over. And finally, as a more recent addition, you can also choose to forsake your physical book every month and just get an audiobook instead, if that is more your style. So lots of flexibility regardless of what kind of reader you are. I will actually be talking about this Book of the Month book later in this wrap-up. It was one of my January picks, but the 2 new books that I picked during in February are The Foxwife and Good Material. The Foxwife is a historical fantasy that focuses on unraveling the mystery behind the deaths of these 2 girls in early 1900s China. I really love books that take inspiration from global folklore and mythology, so when I saw this was on the list, I knew that it would be my pick. It was like a really easy decision for me. I never had the choice. I also picked out Good Material by Dolly Alderton. This is the story of a breakup, told largely from the perspective of a man who was dumped and doesn't understand why and is still really, really heartbroken over it. But also from what I've heard, it sprinkles in the perspective of the ex-girlfriend as well. And I love that. I love books that really lean into there being 2 sides to every story. So this one's on the list as well. And if you want to read either of these or any of the other wonderful books that Book of the Month has on the registry, I strongly recommend giving them a try. You can get your first book this February for only $9.99 with the code SMOOCH. A banger of a deal, if you ask me, for a hardcover that they just bring straight to your door. I just love them. I think they're great. Thank you again to Book of the Month for sponsoring this video. I really appreciate it. Let's get back to it. All right, the first book that I read all the way back at the beginning of December, truly a different time, was Big Swiss by Jen Began. And I saw this book like all over that side of TikTok. That's just hot girl literary fiction read by women who are cooler than me in every conceivable way. I like taking recommendations from there sometimes, but historically it's been kind of hit or miss. For example, I really enjoyed Boy Parts, which was like American Psycho, but for the girls, a woman committing crimes, except is she even committing the crimes or is she just hallucinating? Nobody knows for sure, but she sure is a sociopath. That's the vibe of that book, and I really enjoyed it. But I wasn't that big of a fan of My Year of Rest and Relaxation. I found that book to be kind of boring. And both of those books are pretty widely beloved by the same crowds that recommend this book, so I wasn't really sure what to expect, but I definitely wanted to read it. I thought that the premise sounded really interesting. And the premise is you have this like new age kind of pseudoscientific incompetent vibes sex therapist who is like the only sex therapist inside of this entire town. And this man literally calls himself Om, like the stereotypical meditation noise that white women make when they pretend to be monks. And Om is writing a book or something on his practice, so he ends up hiring this woman named Greta, who is the main character and this recently divorced transcriptionist, to transcribe all of his sessions so that way he can use them in his book. And there is a lot of drama going on inside of this town, and basically all of it circles through Om because he's the only sex therapist. So Greta, being very nosy, gets to know a lot of the people inside of this town through their semi-anonymized sessions with Om. And through all of this, she becomes obsessed with this woman that she calls Big Swiss because this woman is apparently very tall and also from Switzerland. And this woman has the weirdest vibes. She's like kind of a stoic, toxic. She's mean in that way where she's not being intentionally cruel. She's just like super straightforward and honest. She describes herself as having an aura as big as like an aircraft carrier or something. Just, you know, odd, strange, but also kind of alluring, or at least that's what Greta thinks. And long story short, after Greta has been transcribing Big Swiss's sessions for a while, they end up running into each other in the wild. And Greta knows exactly who it is, but obviously Big Swiss does not know who Greta is. And obviously Greta cannot resist the temptation to get to know and ultimately seduce this woman. So they end up having an affair and things happen from there. It's all weird. The plot goes in very bizarre directions. The relationship between the two of them in this book is never believable. Like, it's always clearly incredibly toxic, but that's kind of the point, so it works for the story. I ended up giving this book 3 stars. It wasn't worth the hype for me, but it wasn't bad. Sometimes it was even pretty funny. It just wasn't exactly to my taste. The premise is obviously like super zany, and the characters have really interesting backgrounds, but I found the follow through to be kind of lackluster. The ending to me just kind of felt kooky crazy for the sake of being kooky crazy, but at the same time, somehow I was kind of bored when I was reading the ending. It was a baffling combination of emotions to feel. Thematically, I thought that this book tackled trauma in an interesting way. Big Swiss and Greta both have these pretty tortured pasts, but they deal with them in ways that are completely different. So you kind of get to see both strategies. Big Swiss follows a school of thought where she's just like, oh, you have depression? Have you tried simply getting over it? Oh, you have ADHD? Have you tried making a to-do list? That is her vibe. She is a woman of steel with seemingly zero ability to empathize with the people around her. And meanwhile, Greta is very big on like complete repression and self-destruction. So neither of them, in my opinion, are very effective strategies, but that is part of what makes those conversations so interesting. I feel like there's value to be found inside of that negative space during those discussions. But that's another place where the book kind of drops the ball, in my opinion, because that thematic conversation is never really followed through all the way to the end. This is just the kind of book where there's a lot thematically that's left to the reader. But for me, it felt like something was missing from this, rather than that I had all of the puzzle pieces and it was up to me to put it together, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's my take. I gave this 3 stars. Again, I thought it was fine. It just wasn't really for me. But if you're looking for super absurdist, sapphic, kind of darkly humorous literary fiction for somebody who might really like Otessa Moshfegh, for example, this could really hit for you. I'm just not exactly that. And that's not this book's fault. It's just me. Okay, the next book that I read in December was Birthday Girl by Penelope Douglas. You might recognize this person from elsewhere on this channel in my extended universe. This book is about this girl named Jordan who is dating this super dead-end loser named Cole. And Cole fucks up their apartment somehow, so they end up getting evicted and having to move in with Cole's dad, who is named Pike, like the fish. And Pike is like a super giga ultra dilf who instantly has a connection with Jordan because Jordan is an old soul, and you can tell that she's an old soul because she's like super obsessed with the 1980s, like music and movies and everything, and nobody gets it. Nobody gets her. Nobody except for Pike. Age-wise, Jordan is 19 going on 20 and Pike is 42, so a little bit of an age gap. And the romance inside of this book really doesn't kick off until Cole does Jordan dirty and they break up, and then Jordan starts smashing his dad instead behind his back, which is just tea. You can't tell me that's not tea. I read this for my divorce tier list series that I do for TikTok, and this might shock you coming from me, but honestly, I thought this book was fine. Look, like, obviously there's something inherently problematic to the fact that Pike was old enough to buy illegal beer before Jordan was even conceived. Obviously that's not great. It's a pretty big taboo, but in this case, if you're able to suspend your disbelief, it ends up being an acceptable smutty romance, in my opinion. It didn't like rock my world or anything. I still had some problems with it just as a romance novel. I never really bought the two of them as a couple. Like, they don't really seem to have anything in common, despite the fact that Jordan is obsessed with the 1980s. Pike kind of just was alive during the 1980s. Like, he's not even that into it. So I don't really know what they would like talk about when there's no drama going on around them, but good for them, I guess, that they found each other despite that, despite the immense hurdle of having absolutely nothing in common. And with her old soul thing, we're also constantly told that Jordan is just so mature for her age. She has really been through some things in life. She had to grow up too young, and it's just not true. Like, you can tell me something over and over and over again, you can beat me over the skull with it, but if your characters still act in the book like they have a mental age of 13, I'm not gonna be convinced. And truly, the character development in this book is like microscopic. I don't think that there's a chance in hell that these two people would stay together outside in the real world. But you know what? I still kind of had fun with this. I did. It was silly. This book is literally just, you did me dirty, guess I'll bang your dad, but fleshed out into a 400-page novel. Like, it can't not be silly. Outside of the age gap, outside of the taboo that draws you to pick up the book in the first place, I didn't think that there were any weird secondary problematic things in this book, in the same way that there were weird secondary problematic things in the tome that shall not be named by the same author. Like, the closest thing that you really get to that is that Pike will make these like weird misogynistic comments both inside of his internal monologue and then also to Jordan about the clothes that she is wearing or like who she is going to see But honestly, even that was kind of funny because inside of his internal monologue, he was like, "Shame on you for caring how a woman dresses, you pig. How dare you feel that way? She's her own person. She can wear whatever she wants." But then also you have this other wolf that's like, "But jealousy, but man, but ooga booga." Which honestly, like, if you're gonna say something misogynistic, please hate yourself for it, you know? Like, I'll take that. And that is really the worst thing that Pike does inside of this book. He is obsessed with her. If anything, he's a beta, just completely to her every whim, which is just the way that you need to write a taboo like this if you want to stand a chance of not making me uncomfortable. So I commend you for that, Penelope Douglas, at the very least. And I don't completely understand why they would choose to write Credence after this, but you know, life is full of mysteries. And yeah, for what it was fine. I ended up giving it 3 stars. The next book I read after that was Iron Widow by Shiran J. Zhao. Iron Widow is a science fiction YA dystopian novel that's inspired by the actual life of Wu Zetian, who was the first and only female emperor in all of Chinese history. And that is already super neat, in my opinion. It was really the only draw that I needed to want to read this, but the world of this is so neat. It takes place in this universe where humanity is constantly under siege by these like giant alien mechs. And the only way to defend against them, it seems, is to use these human-controlled mechs that are built out of the scavenged husks of dead aliens to duel them, giant man to giant man, kind of Pacific Rim style. But the dystopian catch to all of this is that to pilot these mechs, 2 people are required, a boy and a girl. And the girls, who serve this more passive role, kind of like as a battery for the men almost, their spirit energy is frequently used up by these gigantic mechs, and they'll die during these battles pretty regularly, leaving the male pilots to take all of the glory for these won battles that are really just won off of the back of these constant sacrifices of the lady pilots. And prior to the beginning of this book, Zetian's sister, who had signed on to be a lady pilot for this like very prominent man, she has died, and Zetian, in her grief, is now hell-bent on infiltrating this male pilot's ranks and killing him in revenge for what he did to her sister, as well as presumably many other girls. And Zetian is able to get this revenge, but it happens in a way that nobody could have really possibly expected, so she ends up getting taken into military custody and partnered up with this guy who is like the most feared and powerful male pilot ever to exist. In a move that the higher-ups hope will have one of 2 results. Like, either this guy will just kill her by virtue of having such powerful energy, like it's not even really completely his fault, it's just kind of how the system works, or alternatively, that won't happen and they'll just have the most powerful mech to ever do it, which would then obviously help the war effort. And the plot really cooks from there. There is a lot going on inside of this world, and it's kind of a hard book to describe, but just take my word for this, the plot is banging in this book. It is incredibly fast-paced, it moves really, really quickly. I think I read the majority of this in one afternoon without even realizing that time was passing, like I kind of just went into a vortex. I also want to shout out that this book had really great and unexpected representation. I don't want to say too much because of spoilers, and because I didn't know when I was going into this book what I was getting myself into, so I feel like how subversive it was really hit. In my opinion, I'm not sure if it was very well developed quite yet, but this is a duology. I imagine that we would get more development and it would become more believable in the second book, but it was really cool and definitely not something that I've ever seen in young adult. Anyways, it probably sounds like I really love this book, at least based on how I'm describing it so far, and I really did love parts of it, but I ended up giving it a 3.5 overall for the following reasons. I did not love the writing. It is first person, but it's quite stilted. It's very short, kind of clipped sentences. It almost felt kind of middle grade with how simplistic it was, and it wasn't like bad per se, but just kind of shallow. Like, the writing wasn't particularly descriptive, but I also didn't feel particularly close to the protagonist, even though we're supposed to be inside of her head. But my bigger problem with this book is that obviously one of the biggest themes inside of this story is feminism. It's tearing down these patriarchal systems that are, you guessed it, biased and flawed, and just pointing out all of the problems with that and kind of just burning the entire thing down, so that way hopefully you can replace it with something better. But all of the women in this book, other than Zetian and like her dead sister, are either mean or traitors or just irrelevant to the story. Like, there's no real connection that Zetian finds with any of these people around her. All of her allies are men, and all of the people looking out for her are men, but this is a story of feminism and of upending patriarchal systems. I just feel like at least one of these women should have been a meaningful, good part of Zetian's life. The fact that none of them are just really undermines, I think, the overarching theme. But with that, I will still be reading book 2, mostly just because I'm really curious about the twist that happens at the end of this book and like the way that the world is. I just want to know. I want to know the answers, and hopefully in that book some of my qualms with the story will also be fixed. So fingers crossed, I'm looking forward to that coming out. But moving on. After that, I read Check and Mate by Ali Hazelwood. I just finally posted the vlog that included me reading this book, and truly the amount of dopamine that was inside of my brain when I was reading this profound. This book is about this girl named Mallory, who was a chess prodigy that stopped playing due to some unresolved tension with her father, who has since passed away. And she doesn't really have a massive amount of direction in life, given that her mother is chronically ill, and therefore Mallory has had to take on a very parental role for her younger siblings. But her best friend ends up convincing her like last minute to join into this charity chess tournament. And Mallory is stressed about this. She hasn't played chess in years, ever since what happened to her father, but she ends up going to this tournament, and through some insane stroke of misfortune / luck, she ends up getting put against the world's best chess player, like #1 ranked globally, who is this 20-year-old guy named Nolan, for her first match in this random charity tournament. Don't ask questions that you don't want answers to. And long story short, she ends up absolutely destroying him. Their game goes viral. It's obviously a big deal, like this random faceless chess person who is also a girl decimating the world champion. Like, it's, you know, sizable in terms of impact. And Mallory gets swept up into competing again, while all the while Nolan is stoking this fascination with her that he has ever since she won that game against him. And they, of course, continue to run into each other throughout this book. That's where the romance comes from. They play a lot of chess. Things happen from there. I'm gonna keep it quick because you guys just saw my thoughts on this, but this book was a delight. I absolutely adored it. Truly, everybody deserves to have at least one silly little book that makes their heart flutter like this book did for me. It's a treat. Ali Hazelwood's books are pretty online. Like, there's a lot of references to celebrities and TikTok and like social media and stuff. And normally when it's other authors, that is the kind of thing that bothers me, but not when it's Ali Hazelwood for some reason. Her books just read so closely to the fan fiction I remember really enjoying when I was a teenager, and she just gets it. She knows how to write an obsessed man. There was a commenter on my last video that had this take, and I'm gonna share it with you because I think it was really good. But Nolan in this book actually likes Mallory as a person. And Ali's other men are like this too. Like, you can tell that they appreciate the character and the personality of the female leads in their books, which you would think would be a low bar in romance novels, but it's not. Like, I've read a lot of books where I'm not completely convinced that the male lead actually likes the protagonist. And Ali is just really good at convincing me that these people like each other. They like spending time together. They like seeing each other. He likes the way that her hair falls in front of her face when she thinks really hard about a chess move. You know, it speaks to me. And I loved him. I loved this man. I thought that he was fantastic. For being YA, this is pretty spicy. Like, it's fade to black, but there is a higher than usual amount of discussion around sex, which I think is important to know if you're trying to decide if a book is right for you. It's really, really similar to Ali's adult romances, I think, in overall tone, but I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. I ended up giving it 4.5 stars because the only real qualm that I had with it was there is this one scene that the entire book is building up to. It feels like slowly, almost from like the 3rd or 4th chapter. And the very last chapter before the epilogue of this book is like the very beginning of this scene that you spend the entire book waiting for. And then the book ends. You don't even get to see that scene. It's just like left to your imagination. It's like I went through the entire book envisioning what that scene would look like, and for what? And for it to be taken away from me, it was criminal. It was not okay. And the more that I thought about it after the afterglow of the epilogue wore off, the more annoyed that I got. But a lot of that anger just came from the fact that I really just had a wonderful time with this. Would recommend if you're looking for something silly goofy. It was fantastic. Okay, next up, really throughout the month of December, I read What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu. And this is a book I talked about much more in depth in my best books of the year video because, spoilers, I gave this 5 stars, so I will spare you from going super in depth on this. But very, very quickly, this is a memoir that is by a survivor of childhood abuse who was ultimately diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And the memoir chronicles both her experiences in her abusive childhood home as well as much later in life when she's getting her diagnosis of CPTSD and ultimately starting to take steps towards healing from what happened to her. I read this book so slowly at first. I feel like the first maybe half of the book, every time I would read, it would just drain my spirit. Absolutely not because it was bad, but because it was just such a heavy book. Like, it's a difficult thing to read about. And just speaking from my experiences, it was the kind of book where I found that I really needed to take my time with it. But it is fantastic. And the back half of the book in particular is this very cathartic journey of like self-acceptance and compassion, which is something that's really difficult for survivors of abuse to have. Like, your self-worth gets drilled out of you when you're hurt like that. So to read such a beautifully written story about finding the will to continue this never-ending process of healing and of growth and of recovery and of rediscovering the light in the world around you that you thought had just completely gone away after what happened is just profoundly uplifting. It is definitely up there, I think, as one of the best trauma memoirs that I've read, and this book is just fantastic. I would recommend it to anybody who is capable of reading it and getting through it. I think it would be a very cathartic book to read for anybody who struggles with similar problems as Stephanie in this book. The last book I read in 2023, kind of concurrently towards the end of reading What My Bones Know, was Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez, and I really enjoyed Part of Your World by the same author. It was one of my favorite romance novels, I think, from last year, so I feel like I went into this book predisposed to just absolutely love it, but I just kind of didn't. I ended up giving this a 3.5. The book is about this woman named Brianna, who is the best friend of the girl main character from Part of Your World. And Bri is this very ambitious, sassy, kind of free-spirited, but ultimately very responsible and loyal to her family person who is working towards this really big promotion at her hospital as a doctor while also dealing with and taking care of her little brother, whose name is Benny. And Benny is suffering from late-stage kidney failure. It's like basically ruined his life. He is a shell of a person that he once was. So even though he's able to kind of live on in perpetuity because of dialysis, it's just a really bad time for everybody involved. So Bri is under this immense amount of stress. And Jacob, meanwhile, the male main character, is this new doctor who has just transferred to Bri's hospital. He has an anxiety disorder, which I think is represented really well in this book, honestly. But also, on top of that, his long-term ex-girlfriend has just gotten engaged to his brother, which is just not a situation that you want to be in. So he is also under a lot of stress. And Bri and Jacob's initial interactions are like mildly antagonistic, also just because honestly Jacob is pretty awkward. But with absolutely zero ulterior motive, Jacob ends up hearing about Bri's little brother Benny, who's in need of a kidney. And it turns out that Jacob's mom had been the recipient of a kidney donation before, so it's become something that Jacob has always wanted to do to kind of pay it forward back into society. So secretly, he decides to see if he's a match for her little brother, and it turns out he is. He ends up donating a fucking kidney to this kid, which is just an unbelievable amount of riz. Like, imagine the hottest man that you've ever seen in your entire life decides to donate a kidney to save the life of the person that you love most in the world. And he doesn't even have an underlying motive because he's just the nicest man to ever walk this planet. I would fold like a plastic chair. It would be over for me. Obviously, there's more to the actual plot of this book with what happens, but that's really the vibe of everything. And let me just say, I loved Jacob. He did not disappoint, in my opinion. I thought that his character was very endearing. Honestly, it's really nice to see a more introverted and nervous man inside of a romance novel. I feel like that's not typically what you get. I also thought that overall his dynamic with Bri was really good. I liked how they looked after each other in social settings. I thought it was really cute. But ultimately, I found the decisions that were made in the second half of this book to be really annoying. There was just so much miscommunication that took up so many pages. I also found the conflict to be kind of repetitive, which is a really easy way to annoy me when I'm reading a romance novel, because chances are the conflict is not going to be interesting enough to bear that much repeating, which in this case, it's really not. Like, as the reader, you know exactly what's going on, and you're just kind of like yelling at them through the pages to talk to each other. And Bri in particular, her character and just her insecurities, I found to be increasingly grating as the book went on. But nothing tops, for me, the fact that this book threw in a trope that I just absolutely despise. It's honestly not even completely the book's fault because it never stood a chance. Like, I don't think that there's a world where this trope could be inserted into any book, and I would think that it was a good decision. And I am going to flash it up on the screen if you don't care about trope spoilers, so close your eyes if you do care, and I'll tell you when to open them. But here we go. I'm about to show it. Like, why? You know? To what end? It never helps anything. Okay, you can open your eyes now. Overall, again, I found this to be fun, especially the first half or so when it was less repetitive. I thought was quite enjoyable. And I really liked the relationship that the characters had. I really liked the man. He felt like nothing that could exist in the real world in the best possible way. But I just cannot abide by the direction that this took in the end. It was not for me. And that is everything from 2023. Now we're finally getting into 2024. Oh my god, this video is gonna be so long. I'm so sorry. The first thing I finished this year was Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. It is this itty bitty novella. And I also gave this book 3.5 stars. This was something that had been sold to me as like life-changing Christmas magic. They just don't make them like this anymore kind of style. And it just was not that, at least for me. The premise of this is it takes place in the 1980s inside of this tiny town in Ireland. The main character is this family man named Bill who has several children. He's a coal miner. It's leading up to the holiday season, so he's quite busy, but he ends up making a delivery to the local convent. And what he discovers there sheds a light on some really despicable things that are happening inside of this town. Overall, I mean, it's really quick. Like, I think I got through this in maybe an hour or two, and I can see why people liked this. The writing is pretty good. It highlights a historical event that I didn't know very much about before I read this, but ultimately the entire thing to me just felt kind of shallow. And that's not just because this book is short. I enjoy short stories. Like, you can fully explore a theme in 20 pages, much less, you know, 100 or however many are in here. But this book just did not. I think in the name of being feel-good and Christmassy, especially around the ending, there just wasn't a lot of depth. And because I read a lot of books with similar subject matter to this, I think it was particularly noticeable for me. And I have some other problems with it that are a little bit more spoilery, but we're not gonna go there because this is a no spoilers wrap up. So all I will say is that I think this is still worth a read if you're looking for something that is well written, short, an interesting look into the past, but ultimately I thought it was pretty forgettable. So I ended up giving it a 3.5. And honestly, that might be kind of generous. I think I would maybe give this a 3 if I were rating it today. It's average. It's not bad. It just wasn't completely for me. The next book I read last month was The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. I also read this for my divorce tier list, And I was intrigued going into this because I had heard a lot of hype for this book online, and I read The Dead Romantics by the same author maybe a year or two ago and found it to be fine, kind of uninteresting given that the premise was supposed to be human girl ex-ghost. I feel like there was potential there to do some fun things that were just kind of not done. But I liked the B-plot in that book enough to give it, I think, 3.5 stars at the time, though I truly remember nothing about it today. So when I heard that the same author had published one of the biggest romances of last year, I was like, sure, let's give it a go. Let's see what happens. The premise of this book is that you have this main character whose name is Clementine. She works in publishing, she's in the city, and Clementine's dearly beloved aunt, who she would go on trips every year with. They were super duper close. This aunt suddenly passes away, but she leaves Clementine her apartment in her will. But this apartment, it's not just any apartment, okay? It's a magical apartment. And seemingly at random, the apartment will just time travel itself 7 years in the past. So Clementine ends up in the past version of this apartment from a summer when her and her aunts were like off in Europe globetrotting the entire time, and the apartment was on loan to the son of one of her aunt's friends. And Clementine runs into this man immediately when the apartment does the magic, and they start to kind of form a relationship from there. This man is named Ewan. He's a chef, he's hot, he names his knives after Jane Eyre characters, and I don't know what else you could need. He's great. But the catch obviously in this book is that they're from different time periods. Like, you can't stay in the timeline outside of the apartment. So Clementine is actually falling in love with the 7 years ago version of Ewan, not who Ewan is today. As you might imagine, this leads to problems, and the plot starts to plot from there. I found the premise of this to be really interesting. I like books like this that are just the smidgen of magical realism in an otherwise contemporary world. And the magic in this book is never explained. Like, there is zero effort made at any point inside of the story to make it make sense. Clementine doesn't understand what's going on, ergo you will not understand what's going on. It's a book that requires you to just accept this arbitrary magical rule set and just roll on with vibes. And I was capable of doing that inside of this book, so overall I found it to be a pretty good time. I ended up giving it 4 stars. Clementine and Ewan are both pretty likable. I think that they have a good dynamic between the two of them, and I expected the past-present thing that was going on inside of this book to be resolved in a way that was completely different from what ended up happening. But I ended up enjoying the thing that the author did, so it worked out. It was cute. I had a good time. In terms of why it didn't get 5 stars from me, there are a couple of reasons. Really, the number one reason is vibes. I will invent motivations that did not necessarily exist. Like, the truth of the matter is it just didn't give me a 5-star feeling. But my invented reasons for taking away some points are the characters just weren't messy enough. Like, there wasn't enough angst given how complicated the premise of this book is. I feel like there was so much potential, but it just felt too easy. Like, the main emotional core of this book is the B-plot, not the romance, and I wanted there to be more angst inside of the romance. And also, I think that just something about Ashley Poston's writing style just doesn't completely hit for me. It's like an uncanny valley version of Emily Henry. Like, tonally, I can tell that she's going for a very similar thing, like a very similar style of almost wry narration, but it's just something is a little bit off in the dialogue and in the thought patterns of the protagonist. I don't know how to describe it. I don't even really have an example. This is just my truth, okay? This is just how I feel, and it's just something doesn't connect all of the way with the way that Ashley writes. But overall, I definitely like this better than The Dead Romantics. I think I would read the next book that she puts out, which is not necessarily how I felt last time. So not worth all of the hype from the internet that I've been seeing for this, but it's still a fun time. All right, the next book that I read, we finally carried on with the vlog that I started in December, and I read A Study in Drowning by Ava Reid. And this one, again, I'm gonna keep short because you just saw a video where I talk about this book a lot more, but I loved this. I thought this was a wonderful time. The very, very brief premise is you have this girl named Effie, who is an architecture student at this super prestigious college. And this girl's entire life, she has been obsessed with this dead author. So when his estate ends up making this competition to redesign his house, Effie is like, sign me up. This is literally my dream job. And the plan that she submits ends up winning. So she goes out to this estate to look at it, to ultimately redesign it, but it's in like awful condition. The foundation is in shambles. The son of the original author refuses to even entertain the idea of moving the house somewhere else. So Effie starts to suspect that she might be getting bamboozled. Like, this might just be an impossible project that she stands no hope of completing. But she decides to stay on the estate because she meets this guy named Preston, who's a literature student from her own college that happens to be digging into the life of this famous author because Preston believes that he's been keeping secrets his entire life. So Effie agrees to help with this goal, and they start to investigate inside of this house. I really enjoyed this. I think that Ava Reid is just a master at creating this luscious, thick atmosphere inside of her books. I felt like I was drinking up the manor and the cliffside off of the page when I was reading this. It was delectable. And Ava's writing is also really good. Like, there are a lot of lines in here that are taken from news articles or the books inside of the book that this dead author once wrote, and sometimes they're better than the actual book, like these pull quotes that they use as epigraphs. It was just delightful. Like, it's very gothic. It has a kind of slower, meandering pace, and I found the central mystery of the book to be kind of predictable by the end, but I still thought it was really well executed. It was a great time. I loved it. I am crying, screaming, dead, actually, just waiting for Lady Macbeth to come out this summer. You are are not going to like the person that I will become when that book releases. Okay, next up I read They're Vicious Games by Joelle Wellington, and this is the kind of book that I feel was just made in a lab for me and exactly my most insufferable interests. The premise of this is essentially Eat the Rich, Murder Bachelor. The main character is this black girl named Adina, who's recently had her admission rescinded to Yale because she got in a fight for justified reasons, but it doesn't matter, she still got her admission rescinded, and the only way that she can conceive to get her admission back is to compete in this underground competition that the richest founding family of her private school does, where they draft like 8, I think, of the most high potential and cool women at this academy, and they compete in a range of different events until ultimately the one that comes out on top ends up essentially adopted into the Remington family. Like, the family will use their ultra rich old money superpowers eternally in order to get that person to wherever they want to go. And this competition apparently happens every year. Like, there are lots of girls out in the world who are now beneficiaries of the Remington family. And Adina ends up finessing her way into this competition, thinking that it's completely above board and normal, only to discover that it's actually quite insane and violent, and who knows if she's going to make it out alive. Not her. I found this to be so much fun. It's in that tub of young adult books where when you're reading it, you're just kind of thinking to yourself, the audacity to put this in young adult, because this book is pretty metal. Like, it's wild what happens to the women in this competition. And I was seated the entire time reading about this. I stayed up until I think like 3 or 4 a.m. finishing this book, which is something that I don't do very often. I try to protect my peace with my sleep, but I would have no peace until I knew what happened. Like, it got to that point in the book and I knew that I never had the choice. There's a lot of commentary in this book on class and race, but by far the most effective commentary, in my opinion, is just how crazy rich white people are in this book and just the crazy things that they do. They are absolutely deranged, and like every character basically in this book, except for like 2, equally deranged. And with that, in terms of depth, like, I wouldn't expect this book to rock your world. Don't forget, it's an Eat the Rich, Murder Bachelor young adult thriller. I don't know why you have such high expectations for it, but it is really good at being exactly what it is. I had a wonderful time. I ended up giving this 4 stars. If you are like me and have insufferable hobbies or like reality TV, this could be good for you. After that, I read the only book that I don't have a physical copy of because I gave it as a present for my best friend's birthday, but I read Rain by Catherine McGee, which is the 4th and final book in the American Royals series. And this is a series that I read over the course of years with my best friend. We like buddy read every single book, and the premise is very simple. It's literally just, what if America was a monarchy still? And our first king was George Washington. So it's the Washington family, and they get up to just as much chaos and nonsense as the British royal family does in the modern day. That is the entire premise. It follows the 3 kids of the modern day royal family: Beatrice, who is next in line for the throne, her younger sister Samantha, who is the spare, and Samantha's slightly younger twin, whose name is Jefferson. And truly, the entire series, all 4 books, has the same 2 plot lines, okay? It is Beatrice is going to be queen soon. How's that gonna go? No one knows. And then it's the entire cast of characters playing musical chairs with each other's relationships. Genuinely, I've never seen an author that has less respect for established relationships. They will just shuffle every single book. People will be dating new characters, sometimes the exes of their siblings. It's insane. And the series becomes this like love octagon, except also 10 times less interesting than I'm making it sound. Like, the books are really mostly boring. The reason why my best friend and I had to read all 4 of them was simply because we had to know how the dice landed. Every character in the series makes every bad decision that they possibly could, but none of them really face consequences, because why would they? This is American Royals. There's no such thing as consequences. It is a series for people who like Love Island and like watching 75 episodes a season of Love Island, and also just want to watch the world burn. And honestly, the last book I think was the worst of the series, because it was clear that the author was done just embodying chaos, and now she kind of wanted it to end as a book with a bow and just be happy for everybody, which meant that half of the characters didn't even really get resolution. Like, they had these strange open-ended endings. But you know what? Like, what did I expect from the ending of this series? Really not much more than that. I wish it had a little bit more chaos like the other 3 books did, but you can't win them all, you know? Catherine had to be done with this eventually. I ended up giving this book a affectionate, probably generous 2.5 stars. Was it good? No. Did I have a great time reading it with my best friend? Absolutely. And that is really what matters. The next book I read was Trickmere, which I read probably over the course of about a month during this time period, and I really enjoy essay collections. I read a bunch of them the first about 1.5 years that I was getting back into reading. And Trickmere is an incredibly popular essay collection. It's by Gia Tolentino. She is a writer at The New Yorker, I believe. Very, very loosely, all of these essays are themed around the concept of self-delusion. Often oftentimes looking at the way that the internet is used as a tool to do that thing, but also just media in general, as well as how women perform femininity, how marriage ultimately is oftentimes a performance, things like that. But the two big subjects are definitely the internet and womanhood and how those two things kind of mix together. And ultimately, I ended up giving this 3.5 stars. I found this difficult to rate because I really like Gia's writing. I think that she has a really incisive voice. She's a great storyteller. She's really good at explaining things in a way that is easily digestible. But ultimately, respectfully, I feel like most of the essays in this collection were kind of cold takes that I had already seen before, captured by authors who I also kind of just think did it better, or did it more emphatically, or in a way that was more unique. If you have never read anything at all about the internet and the way that the internet poisons you and your mind and your friendships and your relationships, I think this could be good for you as a primer. I also think that this explains pretty basic feminist principles really well, but I just kind of found parts of it boring when they were going over those things because, again, I've read them before, like I've seen these ideas before. And based on the hype, I was really hoping for something that was a little bit more novel out of this collection. But with that said, I still gave it 3.5 stars, and it got some bonus points because the essays that Gia wrote that were more about her and more about her own life and her experiences, those I found to be very fascinating. The one I liked the most was Reality TV Me, where Gia talked about her experiences being on this weird boys versus girls reality TV show as like a 16-year-old, which is just very young to be perceived in that space and to have a bunch of editors who are making a character out of you. I'm definitely interested in reading more by Gia in the future. I think that she's a fabulous writer, but I so wish that this had been more worth the hype for me. The next book I read this month, I finally tackled Pachinko by Min Jin Lee, and I ended up giving this book a somewhat disappointed 4 stars. Let me explain. Overall, just on an objective level, I thought this was fantastic. The premise, like with many family sagas, is pretty difficult to capture just because the story is so expansive, but Pachinko follows about 4 generations of this Korean family that moves from Korea to Japan after Korea's annexation, which, by the way, I'm not afraid to admit is not something I don't think I ever learned about in school. I think maybe I had this brief understanding that the reason why Korea was split into 2 was because of complications politically, but certainly I feel like we never talked about Japan as a colonial power in class. So just on a learning about history level, I found this book to be like incredibly educational. I think it's worth the read for anybody who likes historical fiction on that alone. But in terms of what actually happens, there's not a singular plot line really, and the book has like 10 plus different characters that are all getting POV segments. There's just so much happening all the time. It's very ambitious, but part of why the book works is it never really feels that way. Like there are lots of names to remember, there are lots of characters to get to know, but they're introduced and characterized so deftly that I never really felt confused reading this or lost in any capacity. With that said, as you might expect, there are parts of this book that are really heavy. If you have any trigger warnings that you're looking out for, I would recommend looking them up. But the reason why the book was still kind of disappointing to me, even though I think that it was a really effective portrait of the time, I think that the cast of characters was well developed. There are lots of good things that I could say about this book, but ultimately I just didn't really find it to be particularly moving. I feel like it was missing an emotional core that would have really driven home like the weight of everything that was happening to these characters and made it a more memorable story for me. And what I think I mean by that when I'm trying to figure out why I feel this way is the book is written in a style that is quite detached from what is going on. And the pacing of the book also requires that you're just moving on very, very quickly from everything that's happening, which means that there's just never really any time for the reader to dwell. Like a chapter would just end with, and then he died, and then you would just move on immediately to something else without really getting like a clear picture of what are those characters thinking? What are they feeling? How is this impacting them? There was only like one scene in the book where the death was a little bit slower and we were able to see a little bit more of that on the page, but then again, instantly the next chapter we're swept away into doing something else. And a part of me thinks that the book kind of had to be that way in order to also accomplish all of the other things it was trying to accomplish with how, again, expansive and ambitious the story was. But for me as a reader, I appreciate books that take their time with moments like that and let me kind of bask in my misery a little bit before we just move on to the next thing. So yeah, I still enjoyed this. I'm still giving it 4 stars. I think that if you like historical fiction, it would be a slam dunk for you, but I just wanted more from it based on what I'd heard. I wanted it to be all of my wildest dreams inside of one book, and of course it was not. The second to last book that I read last month was First Lie Wins by Ashley Elston, and I was really surprised by how much I ended up enjoying this. The premise is you have this girl named Evie who is this all-American Southern girl. She has a doting boyfriend, she has a job at a restaurant, and the twist is that Evie is actually a con artist under deep cover trying to infiltrate the life of her boyfriend. She doesn't even really know why she's on this mission or what she's supposed to do. She's like awaiting further instruction when suddenly she meets somebody at a party that like really shakes things up, and she's forced to figure out how to crime her way out of this pickle that she has found herself in. I had so much fun reading this. I found the plot to be so exciting and so interesting and ultimately really satisfying with the way that everything came together. I just think that women should be allowed to do crimes more often, at least in books, if nowhere else. It's just such a good time to read about. I ended up giving this book 4 stars, and there are 2 reasons why this book didn't get a higher score. First of all, the dialogue, especially in I think like the first quarter of this book, was when I noticed it the most. Nobody talks like that. Like, these people will say things and I'm just like, you are an alien trying to mimic human speech. And dialogue like that can really take me out of books, but I really honestly didn't care because I was having such a good time. And the other reason why it doesn't get 5 stars is because as satisfying as I found the ending, as much as I enjoyed it, it's the kind of ending, it's the kind of collection of twists where like, it's not completely earned. Like, if you think about it too hard, the world of this book kind of falls apart and it stops making like any degree of sense. But my solution for you is just don't think about it too hard. Just let yourself have a good time. Let yourself read a cheeky little thriller about women who commit crimes. Right? First Light Wins, 4 stars. Really fun, really twisty, really entertaining. And finally, the last book I read this January, the behemoth of a novel, The Winners by Frederick Bachman. This is the 3rd book in the Beartown series, which I feel like I have summarized in basically the last 5 videos on my channel, so I'm just gonna skip it. We're not gonna do a summary. Let's just go straight to my takes. I talk so much more in depth on this during my recent vlog. This was the last book, but as much as I loved Beartown, which was my 2nd favorite book of last year, just fantastic, life-affirming, absolutely phenomenal read, would recommend to anybody. Us Against You, the 2nd book, and then this book, The Winners, I just don't really feel like they needed to exist. In my opinion, you can totally read Beartown as a standalone book. I think it tells a complete and cohesive story. And the other 2 books in the trilogy, I think, should be treated as more like bonus content than standalone books on their own. Us Against You, I think, was better. The first half was pretty repetitive, but the second half, I think, did have some real novelty to it and some cool characters that were introduced. But The Winners, especially, was just so superfluous in comparison to the rest of the series, and I feel like most of the emotional beats of the story were only so effective because of how much I cared about the characters from book 1. But overall, despite all of that, I still ended up giving it 3.5 stars because did this book need to exist? No. Did it still ruin my life? Absolutely. I cried the entire night before I went to bed. The ending was criminal. The ending was so cruel. And again, I don't think it's essential. I don't think that you're really missing out on a massive amount if you only read the original Beartown, but as somebody who is a fan of the original book, I am still glad that I got to spend more time in this world. I'm glad that there were more books for me to kind of fall into, so that way I didn't have to say goodbye to all of these characters. And Frederick Bachman, even when he's writing books that maybe don't need to exist, he's still such a gifted storyteller. That man could make me cry about an orange going bad in the fridge or something otherwise completely inconsequential. He's Superman in terms of playing with my emotions. And that is still true for this. And for that reason, it was still worth it for me. I'm glad that I read it, but I just really wanted more from it. I wanted it to justify its right to exist. I wanted it to be its own thing, and it just wasn't, but that's okay. But that's it, we made it. That is December and January finished. Who's to say if I'll do a February wrap up or if it'll be bi-monthly again? I like to keep you guys on your toes. But either way, I really appreciate you being here for however long this video is. You guys rock, and I love you. And please remember to like this video if you have not already. It actually helps me a lot, so it'd be cool of you. And if you're new and you like me and you want to stick around, please also subscribe. It's a cool thing to do here on this channel. We all have done it before. Many people are saying that it is safe and will bring you joy. What am I saying? I need to stop. Okay, I don't have anything else to say. Bye!